What if the worst thing that ever happened to you was actually the system working exactly as designed? Think about that for a second. Because most people, when they lose their job, when they can't pay rent, when the savings account hits zero and the phone stops ringing, they assume they did something wrong. They blame themselves. They lie awake at 3 in the morning staring at a water stain on the ceiling, convinced that smarter people, better people, are sleeping just fine. But here is the dark secret that the men who built this system never wanted you to figure out. The collapse was not a malfunction. The panic, the poverty, the feeling of falling through the floor of your own life, that was the machine doing exactly what it was built to do. And somewhere in the wreckage of the 1930s, a handful of ordinary people figured that out. They found something ancient, something the Greeks had written down 2,000 years before the first stock ticker ever clicked. And they used it to not just survive the worst economic disaster in modern history, but to come out the other side harder, clearer, and more free than they had ever been before. That is the story we are going to tell today. A story about what happens when the floor gives way, and who you become when you stop waiting for someone to fix it. Let us go back, not to a textbook, not to a graph with lines going down. Let us go back to a Tuesday morning in October of 1929, because that is where this story really begins, and it does not begin with bankers. It begins with a shoeshine boy. His name does not matter. He was about 17 years old, working a corner near Wall Street in Lower Manhattan, and in the weeks before the crash, he had been doing something that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. He had been taking his tips, his small, greasy, hard-earned coins, and putting them into the stock market. Everyone was doing it. The elevator operators were doing it. The school teachers were doing it. A woman in Ohio had reportedly taken out a second mortgage on her house to buy shares in a radio company she had never visited and whose actual business she could not explain. The stock market in 1929 was not a financial instrument. It was a religion. And like all religions at the height of their power, it demanded total belief and punished doubt. That shoeshine boy had heard the gospel from the men whose shoes he polished every morning. Men in three-piece suits with gold watch chains and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been wrong yet. They told him the market only goes up. They said it with a certainty of gravity, and for a while, they were right. The 1920s had been a decade of genuinely staggering growth. Factories were humming. Cars were rolling off assembly lines faster than roads could be built to drive them on. A new thing called the radio was pulling voices out of thin air and delivering them into living rooms across the country. It felt like the future had finally arrived, and the stock market was the ticket to ride it. And then on that Tuesday in October, the ticket became worthless. In a single day, the market lost billions. Not millions, billions. In a single week, fortunes that had taken decades to build vanished like morning fog. Men who had been millionaires on Monday were on the phone with their brokers on Friday trying to understand a number that started with a minus sign and never seemed to end. The shoeshine boy lost everything he has saved. But here is the thing that nobody talks about in the polished version of this history. He was luckier than most of them, because he had only lost money. The men in the suits, the ones with the watch chains and the certainty, many of them had lost borrowed money, money they owed to other people. And that is a different kind of falling. That is, falling with someone else's hand around your ankle, pulling you deeper. Within 3 years of that Tuesday, 1 in 4 American workers had no job. Not 1 in 20, not 1 in 10, 1 in 4. Picture your street. Picture every fourth house dark in the morning, no one leaving for work, curtains drawn against a day that has nothing to offer. Bread lines stretched around city blocks in Chicago and New York and Detroit, lines of men in hats and overcoats who had been, 2 years earlier, managers and machinists and salesmen with business cards and modest pride. Now they were standing in the cold waiting for soup. Not because they were lazy, not because they were stupid, because the machine had chewed them up and the people who ran the machine had already made sure their own exits were covered. This is the part of the story where most people expect a hero to show up, a president, a policy, a new law that rights the wrong. And yes, eventually, some of those things came. But in the years between the crash and any meaningful recovery, there was a gap. A long, gray, hungry gap where ordinary people had to figure out on their own how to keep living when all the systems they had been taught to trust had stopped working. And in that gap, something remarkable happened. People began to rediscover a way of thinking that had been sitting in old books for 2,000 years, waiting to be needed badly enough. The Stoics were not a political party. They were not a religion, though they thought about God more than most. They were a loose school of thinkers who had gathered in ancient Athens and later Rome, men like Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca, who had spent their lives trying to answer a single question. What do you do when the world will not cooperate with your plans? Epictetus is the one who matters most for this story, because Epictetus had a credential that no Harvard economist has ever matched. He had been a slave. Born into bondage in the 1st century, property of a man who reportedly broke his leg just to watch him endure it, Epictetus had every reason to be consumed by bitterness and despair. He had no money. He had no freedom in the conventional sense. He could not vote, could not own property, could not walk away from his situation. And yet, by the accounts of people who knew him, he was one of the most psychologically free human beings who had ever lived, because he had found the one door in the prison that no master could ever lock, the door that leads inward. His core idea was almost insultingly simple. He said, "There are things in your control and things that are not. Your opinions, your desires, your responses, those are yours. The weather, other people's behavior, the stock market, the decisions of bankers you will never meet, those are not yours. The suffering," he argued, "almost always comes from the confusion between these two categories, from treating things outside your control as if they were inside it, and then feeling personally destroyed when they do what outside things do, which is whatever they want." In the 1930s, this idea was not being taught in universities. It was not on the radio. It was sitting in old books, in library basements, and it was being rediscovered not by professors but by people who were desperate enough to actually use it. Consider a man named Arthur. We will call him Arthur because this is the kind of story that has 100,000 Arthurs in it, each one real, each one forgotten by the official history. Arthur had worked for 15 years as a printing supervisor in Cleveland, Ohio. He had a house, a wife, 2 children, a Ford Model A that he washed every Saturday morning. He was, by every measure available to him, a man who had done everything right. He showed up, he worked hard, he saved a percentage of his wages, he believed in the bargain that the country had implicitly offered him. Work hard, play by the rules, and you will be okay. The printing company closed in the spring of 1931. Arthur spent 3 months doing what everyone told him to do, which was to go find another job. He put on his best suit, which was the only suit he had not yet sold, and he walked into offices and factories and businesses all over the city. He was told, politely and then less politely, that there was nothing available. He came home each evening to a house that was getting quieter in a way that had nothing to do with noise. His wife moved around the kitchen with careful, deliberate movements, the way people move when they are trying not to disturb something fragile. His children had stopped asking for things. One evening, Arthur walked to the public library, not because he had a plan, but because it was warm and free and nobody in there expected him to produce anything. He pulled a book off the shelf almost at random. It was a translation of the Meditations, written by Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who had somehow also been a philosopher. Arthur was not a philosophical man. He had never read anything like it, but he sat in that warm library and he read a sentence that stopped him cold. Marcus Aurelius had written, roughly translated, that you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Arthur read it again. Then he sat with it for a long time. Now, understand what was happening in Arthur's mind in that moment, because this is the key to everything. For months, Arthur had been treating his unemployment as a verdict, as a judgment on his worth as a man, a husband, a father, a human being. Every rejection letter was another piece of evidence in a case being built against him by a prosecutor he could not see and could not cross-examine. He had internalized the failure of an entire economic system as a personal moral failing, and that internalization was doing something very specific to him. It was costing him the only thing he had left: his ability to think clearly and act decisively in the space where he actually had some power. Stoicism does not tell you that things are fine when they are not fine. That is not what Marcus Aurelius was saying. He was not a man who lived a comfortable life and told others not to complain. He ruled an empire while plague swept through it and killed millions, while wars threatened the borders he had inherited. While his own health was failing and his chosen successor had turned out to be a catastrophic disappointment, he knew, intimately, the experience of the world refusing to cooperate. What he had found, and what Arthur was finding in that library in Cleveland on a cold night in 1931, was a precise and functional way to sort the world into two piles: the pile you can do something about, and the pile you cannot, and then to put every single ounce of your energy into the first pile, and to genuinely, practically, almost violently let go of the second. This is the moment to talk about how the system actually works, because Arthur's story does not exist in a vacuum. It exists inside a machine, and understanding the machine is not optional if you want to survive it. The financial system that collapsed in 1929 had been built on a very particular idea. The idea that growth never stops, that the line always goes up, that tomorrow's prize is always higher than today's. This idea was not an economic theory. It was a psychological trap, dressed up in a suit and given a seat at a respectable table. Because the moment you believe the line always goes up, you start making decisions based on the assumption of a future that is not guaranteed. You take on debt against assets you assume will appreciate. You build a life on projections rather than on what is real and solid and in your hand right now. The banks understood this mechanism perfectly. Margin buying, which was the practice of purchasing stocks with borrowed money, became the rocket fuel of the 1920s boom. A man could walk into a broker's office and buy $100 worth of stock for $10 down, borrowing the remaining $90 against the expected rise in value. As long as the stock went up, everyone looked like a genius. The broker got his commission, the bank got its interest, and the investor got to watch his $10 bet turn into what appeared to be genuine wealth. The machine was printing confidence along with the money, and the confidence was the more dangerous currency by far. What the investors did not fully understand, and what the people who designed the system understood very well, was the asymmetry of the arrangement. When the stock went up, the investor kept the gains. When the stock went down below a certain threshold, the broker issued what was called a margin call. Pay up the difference right now, in cash, or we sell everything you own to cover the debt. In a rising market, this clause sat in the fine print of the contract, invisible, harmless, theoretical. In a falling market, it became a weapon. A simultaneous, system-wide weapon that activated for millions of investors at the same moment, forcing them all to sell at exactly the worst possible time, which drove prices down further, which triggered more margin calls, which forced more selling. This is what a death spiral looks like up close. Not a natural disaster, not an act of God, a mechanism, a sequence of cause and effect that had been baked into the design of the system, invisible during the good times, catastrophic when the cycle turned. And the people at the top of the system, the ones who understood the mechanism best, many of them had already quietly moved their money out of the market in the months before October of 1929. The Senate hearings that came later would reveal that certain prominent bankers had been short-selling, betting on a decline, at the very moment they were publicly reassuring ordinary investors that everything was fine. Let that settle for a moment. The people telling you the machine is safe were already collecting their winnings on the bet that it would break down. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented congressional testimony. It is a matter of public record, and it tells you something essential about the relationship between the people who build financial systems and the people who are invited to participate in them. The invitation is not offered out of generosity. The participation of ordinary people is the fuel. Their optimism, their savings, their borrowed money. That is what makes the machine run. And when the machine needs to reset, it is their losses that cushion the fall for the people who were never really at risk in the first place. This is the villain of our story. Not a single person, not a single bank, but a structural relationship. A way of organizing economic life that privatizes the gains during the good years and socializes the losses during the bad ones, in the cruelest possible sense of the word socializes. The losses go to the people least equipped to absorb them. They go to Arthur in Cleveland and the shoeshine boy in Manhattan and the woman in Ohio with the second mortgage on her house. They go to the people who believed in the bargain because they had no reason not to. Now here is where the Stoics come back in, because the Stoic answer to this revelation is not rage. It is not despair. It is something that looks, from the outside, almost like cold water. Arthur, sitting in his library, was not going to fix the financial system. He was not going to get his job back by being angry about the margin call mechanism. He was not going to retrieve his sense of self-worth by sending a strongly worded letter to a bank executive. None of those things were in the pile of what he could control. What was in that pile, the real pile, the one that actually mattered, was considerably smaller and considerably more powerful than he had been treating it. He could control how he spent the next 12 hours. He could control which skills he chose to develop in the time he now had. He could control whether he told his wife the truth about their finances or continue the exhausting performance of manufactured calm. He could control what he taught his children during this period, about money, about resilience, about the difference between what you are worth and what the market says you are worth on a given Tuesday. He could control his body, which he had been neglecting, and his mind, which he had been filling exclusively with catastrophe. The Stoics had a practice they called negative visualization. It sounds grim on the surface, and it is, slightly. The exercise is to sit quietly and genuinely imagine the worst-case scenario. Not to panic about it, not to wallow in it, but to look it in the face, specifically and clearly, until it loses the terrifying power of the vague and unknown. Marcus Aurelius did this constantly. Epictetus taught it explicitly. In the 1930s, people were doing it accidentally, because the worst-case scenario was not hypothetical. It was the actual present tense of their lives. And the ones who survived it with their minds and their dignity intact were the ones who stopped flinching from the reality of it and started dealing with it on its own terms. Concretely, what this looked like in the 1930s was a radical reimagining of what a good life actually required. People who had defined their identity through consumption, through the house, the car, the new suit, the vacation, suddenly found themselves in a world where those things were simply gone. And in that absence, something unexpected happened to some of them, not all of them. This is not a story with a happy ending for everyone. But some of them discovered that the identity they had been purchasing on the installment plan had been a substitute for something more durable that they had neglected to build. Communities rebuilt around genuine mutual aid, not the polished philanthropic version that gets named after wealthy donors, but the raw, unglamorous, practical kind. Neighbors sharing tools and food and childcare. Extended families moving back under one roof, not as a symbol of failure, but as a genuine pooling of resources against a common threat. People growing food in yards and vacant lots, repairing things rather than replacing them, building skills with their hands that 2 decades of industrial prosperity had made it seem unnecessary to maintain. This was not romance. This was not nostalgia. It was hard, and it was often desperate, and it would be dishonest to paint it as anything other than what it was. But inside that hardness, something real was being learned, something the prosperity of the 1920s had made it very difficult to learn. The lesson that security, genuine security, does not come from the balance in an account that someone else controls and can close without warning. It comes from the things you know how to do, the people who would take your call at 2 a.m, the skills that live in your hands and your mind, and that no margin call can ever touch. Epictetus, the former slave, had understood this with a clarity born from the most extreme possible version of material poverty. He owned essentially nothing. He had, for much of his life, been legally owned himself, and he had concluded that the only wealth that cannot be taken from you is the wealth of a trained mind and a clear understanding of what you actually need versus what the world has convinced you to want. The distinction between those two categories is not small. It is, in many ways, the entire game. In the 1930s, ordinary people were being forced by catastrophic circumstance to relearn this distinction in real time. The ones who came through it not merely intact, but genuinely changed, genuinely wiser, were the ones who stopped fighting the reality of their situation and started mining it. Who looked at the stripped-down version of their life and asked, honestly, what is here that I actually need, and what was I carrying that was just weight? The system will fail again. This is not a prediction wrapped in pessimism. It is simply what systems do. They build, they inflate, they crack, they reset. The 1930s were not the first time, and 1929 was not the last crash. And the people reading this in whatever year they happen to be watching know that the cycle did not stop with the New Deal or the post-war boom or any of the other chapters that came after. The machine keeps running. The asymmetry never really goes away. The fine print is still there, still waiting for the market to turn. What the Stoics offer, what Arthur found in that library, and what the shoeshine boy might have found if someone had handed him the right book, is not a way to beat the system. It is something more useful than that. It is a way to stop being beaten by it, to draw a clear line in your own mind between the parts of this world that belong to you and the parts that never did. To build a life on the solid ground of that line, rather than on the shifting sand of a market price or a job title or a number in an account that someone else is ultimately in charge of. The Stoics did not promise comfort. They promised clarity. They promised that if you did the work of understanding what is actually in your control, and if you put your energy there with a kind of discipline that comes from genuine conviction rather than temporary motivation, you would find yourself in possession of something that the crash of 1929 could not take from Epictetus, and that the Great Depression could not take from the people who had found it. A self that does not depend on the market to validate it. A life that does not require the machine to keep running in order to keep meaning something. That is not a small thing. In a world designed to keep you perpetually dependent, perpetually one bad quarter away from losing everything you thought defined you, the ability to genuinely, practically, functionally not need the machine in order to be okay is the most radical act available to an ordinary person. It was radical in 1931, and it is radical now. It will be radical the next time the floor gives way, which it will. The question is not whether the system will fail you. The question is who you will be when it does.